Imagine a newspaper as a patient in palliative care. He's the worst kind of patient, and yes, the newspaper is definitely a he. Stubborn and outraged that he's dying, he's constantly on the buzzer, opining to the ward about everything from the state of hospital food, where do his taxes go, and that surely a doctor younger than him isn't quite ready to practice. But his favourite topic is, of course, himself, the impending death of the newspaper, and who's to blame. Sure, he smoked like a fanny in Thailand's Patpong red light district, and he drank copious amounts of booze to support the pissed, tortured, but ultimately heroic stereotype of a wild, mudraking journo. But this patient is adamant that the internet is to blame. First it was television, and now it's the net. It's the medium that's to blame for the newspaper's economic decline. Also to blame is you, and you and you. You apathetic, attention-deficient young people. The inadequate Gen X who can't be trusted at the wheel, and those self-absorbed Gen Ys who'd rather upload photos of themselves onto the web than read the national news. I've one word for that, old man, and that's bullshit. But first, let's take the torch from this man in palliative care, the one that he claims is his duty to shine into dark places, and shine it back on him. Rarely is the journalist's presence ever acknowledged in the media. Instead, what the public sees is much like a film set. Out of sight are the booms, the camera operators, reporters yelling out questions, photographers, flashing of cameras, the whirring of machinery, or nudging the story into shape. And it's funny because William Gass, an American writer, once said that in fiction there is no noise, that everything within the margins is meant to be there. No one goes to the toilet unless it's for narrative purposes, or prior to a car chase, a character never ducks into a petrol station to fill up. Yet to me, it's the news that seems so seamless. Quotes are circulated, the usual people are on the ready to go on the record, there are no awkward exchanges. Journalists often respond to criticism with the old saying, "Don't shoot the messenger," without realising the very complicity of these words. They are the messenger of sorts. Back and forth, the journalist travels between opposing groups, the righteous right and the predictable lefties, Liberal and Labor, Christian evangelist, unhinged Muslim spokesman. Even in the Melbourne's famous underbelly, the journalist played a key role in delivering messages between the Carlton crew and the Carl Williams crew. And all this message delivering is in the guise of observing the story unfold. People that would never meet do meet, and often in false and loaded settings. Reality TV's tactic of gathering an explosive collection of people, all harbouring binary hatreds, is journalism at its worst. I was 23 years old when I first set foot in the newsroom at a newspaper. I wasn't the youngest new arrival, but I was definitely the most naive. I hadn't studied journalism at university, and I was stunned at the extent of scaffolding behind the news. I once asked a press secretary in a ministerial department to spell her name, so I could quote her. And a bewildered silence met me at the end of the line. Finally, she said, "You're just right that the minister said it." "Oh," I replied, "but did he?" "In a way, yeah." So my copy read, "The Premier's press secretary wouldn't spell her name for me, said that Premier Bax said this in a way." So, and while this handy leaving out of certain realities of information not relevant to the public is necessary for a newspaper not to use the entire Brazilian rainforest on its first print run, it does have its fallout. In the news, an editor will often tell a reporter to find a human way into the story, and fate will provide, read press secretary, a human face. Hence the ultimately precarious rise of individual politics, parties that will sell an individual to the public, only to hold that image to party consensus. And so the concept of personalising the news to make it accessible ends up simplifying some fairly abstract concepts, systems, or institutions, and protects entrenched bureaucracies. And this way, if something has to hang in a kind of public shaming, the face will, but the structure of the party will remain intact. And so the ruse of the newsroom continued for me. Outside the magistrate courts, I accidentally tripped up a media pack as they ran backwards whilst yelling questions at a man who was trying to pretend they didn't exist. When the TV cameraman yelled at me, I said I was really sorry. Only now do I think, hang on. There was 10 people, you're all holding booms and this ridiculous equipment, and then you all decide to run backwards? I mean, what's that about? Surely if someone emerging from a session wanted to speak to you, they'd stop. So I found myself in situations where I'd have to run if the media pack ran. Often we'd only be running because someone else was running, and I'd never know if we were all following the lead runner to the toilet or to a scoop, but nevertheless we would run together. To the front of the police station, to the back entrance, back to the front, and then back to the back again, fueled by a fear that if we didn't follow the pack, we'd miss out on a story everyone else managed to get, and then we'd be shamed because our news wouldn't be the same as everyone else's news. During the Kevin 07 Australian federal election, of all the thousands of news stories generated, one story stood out to me. A small 250-word piece by Fairfax journalist Jewel Topsfield. It was about a shopper knocked unconscious in a Victorian shopping mall by a boom that was poking out of a media scrum, jostling around the former Prime Minister John Howard as he shook hands with everyday people. The article was accompanied by a photo showing a dismayed John Howard, several journalists and camera operators uselessly standing around the unconscious woman, splayed in her fleecy tracksuit on the shopping mall floor. To me, this story broke through the fiction of the media. It revealed everyone for what they are on a campaign trail, for the most part an utter waste of resources, contributing to the process of nullifying the voter, in this case an unconscious shopper. So what would happen if journalists took a step back and acknowledged their role in shaping the news? Well, for one, the audience would begin to recognise themselves in the news, both locally and internationally. Take the famous photograph taken in 1968 by Eddie James in Vietnam. I'm going to hold it up to you just to jog your memory. Does everyone remember this photo? We might not remember it, but you're aware of it. It's entitled Saigon Execution, and it's now commonly referred to as General Nguyen Ngoc Long executing a Viet Cong prisoner in Saigon. It's an important photograph that's often referred to as changing American public opinion on the Vietnam War. It's also a photograph discussed by the late Susan Sontag in her work regarding the pain of others. There can be no suspicion about the authenticity of what is shown, writes Sontag. Nevertheless, it was staged by General Lone, who had led the prisoner, hands tied behind his back, out onto the street where journalists had gathered. He would not have carried out the summary execution there had they not been available to witness it. The photo is, as Sontag says, authentic. The photograph is horrific. A photograph taken further back of the execution and the gathered journalists watching the execution would have been equally, if not more, horrific. And it would have revealed a new truth, an even more complex truth, where the media is complicit and their subject, the general, not only returns the journalist's gaze, but he decides to make a show of it. An audience seeing this kind of reportage would have been less able to separate themselves from the image because their complicity is right there with the gathered journalist. They would have had to ask themselves, why are we there? Why are we giving this action oxygen? And this is not to say that the prisoner might have survived if the journalist went around to witness his execution as a kind of media performance. But it is disturbing that securing the attention of journalists, their sport of immediacy and reporting news day in, day out, seems to have become a kind of militant strategy. Consider September 11, 2001. In Mark Danner's essay, Words in a Time of War, on Rhetoric, Truth and Power, Danner discusses the footage of the aeroplanes flying into the Twin Towers. He stated that truly the weapon that day was not the box cutters in the hands of 19 young men, nor airliners at their command. The weapon that day was the television set. A powerful statement. Yet to me, what I found the most disturbing about the events in the New York attack was the speechlessness of the news anchors and reporters as the second plane hit the Twin Towers. The media was present, yes, but they couldn't frame it. And strangely, considering all the brouhaha about the immediacy of the news, about journalists being the first on the scene, this was, for me, the first time the media had ever been immediate. 10 minutes later, and the media had already begun its process of separation by narration. But I always come back to that 30 seconds. There was something very real and very refreshing about them not knowing, of seeing a journalist out of their depth, unable to package the story. And for a news cycle that does claim to be about immediacy, then why is it always too late to intervene? The news is always upon us. Like the sky falling in, we slouch under its weight. In 1991, the head of Oxfam America stated the problem with famines is that they aren't considered newsworthy until the dying begins. And so, he complained, before the massive die-off, we try to find a way to dramatise the situation. And it is arrogant to say that what goes on in the media determines the outcome for people in desperate need of help. In fact, there is too much reliance on the media's ability to change these things, and often the presence of journalists gives a sense of false hope to its subject. But this tireless focus on the visible, on raw emotion in a news cycle, is not, according to me, true journalism. Consider the onslaught of the media coverage post-September 11, which did little to provide an informed understanding and analysis of the attack. Rather, much of the news stayed on the raw emotion, mesmerised by the collective gasp as the towers fell. At the time, it occurred to John Hockenberry, then a correspondent for Dateline at the NBC, that the media had an obligation, a duty to explain, even belatedly, the origins and significance of organisations such as Al-Qaeda. Many journalists agreed with him, but at the NBC, Hockenberry was firmly told to keep on the emotional centre of their audience. Instead of helping the public understand what had happened to their city, it was important to maintain high emotion, with a special series made on the heroes of 9/11, the firefighters. Like the show Cops, only with firefighters, said a producer to Hockenberry. It's crucial to note that increasingly journalists are urged by their superiors to not just report on trauma and tragedy, but to focus on it, often to the detriment of getting over it. And contrary to popular belief, it's interesting to note that even Sigmund Freud, the godfather of psychoanalysis, was eager to get away from the obsessive focus of trauma in his patient sessions. Freud was more concerned with his patients' everyday patterns and how trauma manifested itself in reactions and actions in ordinary life. The misconception about trauma is that it occurs during an event, the visible on which the media is so focused, whereas trauma is actually the product of an experience. It does not necessarily stem from an event alone. It's how one repeats or represents it. Trauma, as Freud saw it, is not so much an inability to tell a story, but an inability to interpret the story. In Chloe Hooper's The Tall Man, a sustained investigation into the death of an Indigenous man in police custody on Palm Island, Hooper questions the haphazard spotlighting by the daily media. The war between police and Indigenous Australians is a false battleground, she wrote. The spotlight on Hurley, the accused policeman, and Demoji, locked in a death struggle, ignored the great horror taking place off stage. Why does the news stay on these false battlegrounds, unable to take the battle beyond the horizon where the emotion fizzles out? And by staying in the emotional centre and giving all sides a hearing, no matter how irrelevant, vitriolic, ill-informed, hysterical and morally outraged, is not for all its noble fanfare press freedom. It is the media's attempt at entertainment and a flawed marketing ploy. And before this talk turns into a tired debate about censorship, that without a free press we support public silences and atrocities that go unreported, I want to refer to an article in the Zimbabwe Times by journalist Patina Gapar. According to Gapar, it appears that the totalitarian regime of her country is benefiting from this ruse of a free press. Gapar writes, "It is occasionally necessary to take a holiday from reading Zimbabwean newspapers. I fear that the daily dose of news from these sources will sour the taste of life's sweet things, raise my blood pressure to stratospheric levels and imperil my sanity. In my more paranoid moments, I believe that the collective purpose of the press in Zimbabwe, both the private and public media, both print and online publications, is to obfuscate and not to enlighten, to speculate, not to report, to dissemble and not to inform, and above all, to make us all pawns in their games of one-upmanship. Sound familiar? Like British tabloids and American media circus Australia? It seems that the sport of fast news is a welcome distraction wherever we are, and that thoughtless journalism dressed up as a free press is far from free in a democracy or in a dictatorship. Irresponsible framing of the news and lazy reporting is, in a sense, a kind of censorship. It's also economic suicide, because in the end, as Tom Rosenstiel, a former media critic for the Los Angeles Times, argued, what journalism companies are selling is their authority as a public asset. And that depends, especially with the ever more sceptical public, on proving you're in it for more than a buck. Most newspaper editors will be the first to admit that the average reader allows 15 minutes maximum for the daily newspaper. Therefore, it's been decided news has to be eye-catching, as in conflict-driven, and snack-sized. News in the paper is not so much news anymore than it is a personal best, a game of Space Invaders, a shooting gallery of disposable stories. And apparently the consumer does not have time for analysis or grey areas. Just give them the who, the when, what, how and where, congeal it into 20 centimetres and move on. It appears that we as a news audience are attention deficient, conflict-driven and unable to grasp abstract concepts. Or is it the media who is attention deficient, conflict-driven and unable to grasp abstract concepts? What's the point of communication if it hasn't occurred? On a recent aeroplane journey, I was squished into the window seat next to a passenger who wanted me to understand that global warming did not exist. The whole thing is a scam, a fear campaign, he said, reeling off books I should read. Scientists I ought to trust. Not bloody Flannery, he growled, and so on, until I couldn't stand it anymore. My subtle cues of flicking through the magazine were not picked up on. Enough, please. The man drew back from me. I can tell you already that I'll be convinced if I read the books you've listed. Listen to those scientists. Everyone is very convincing. The man shrugged as if I was the one who'd been talking at him for half an hour. But it was too late. I'd taken the bait and I couldn't stop. How can you be so confident? It's not climate change that scares me. It's your certainty that scares the hell out of me. The man shook his head smugly, disagreeing. It's a climate change campaign that's getting you agitated. Look at you. They've got you in a panic. At the end of the flight, the man turned to me, this time saying, isn't it nice that we can have a conversation and disagree? And be okay with that. You can't do that in other countries. That's freedom of speech for you. Eager to get off the plane, unable to record agreeing or disagreeing with him, I nodded dumbly and imagined what an argument would be like with him if that was his idea of a conversation. And I'm reminded of this encounter most days. When I reach for the newspaper, when I listen to Talkback, when I watch Parliamentary Question Time and the evening news. And I wonder if it's my own industry's fault, the media's fault for this conversation, or better put, the lack of conversation. According to another psychoanalyst, this time a Frenchie, Jacques Lacan, truth does not result from interaction. Truth is interaction. Of his doctor-patient processes, Lacan once stated that the subject begins analysis by speaking about himself without speaking to you, or by speaking to you without speaking about himself. When he can speak to you about himself, the analysis will be over. All of us know people like the patients Lacan describes. We may even unwittingly be these people. The kind that talk but do not listen, although we may have mastered the intermittent pause and a slight nod of the head, or the kind that listen but don't contribute. That Lacan found this inability to converse pathologically problematic. This is a particularly scary notion when it comes to analysing the current state of the news media. Daily, Western people, audiences surrender their thoughts opinions, memories and experiences to the media in the guise of being listened to. But while talkback overflows with the public's right of reply, these sessions can hardly be called conversational. They're more like a battle of certainties, an ugly mimic of question time, which is more theatre than a window into governance. Similarly, reporting in general has become a clash of certainties, a game of speed chess, strategic, thought-provoking, yet ultimately predictable. And as on the aeroplane, our daily interactions have begun to mimic this, the finger-pointing, the puffed-up self-importance, an unquestioning reliance on statistics, as if Einstein and his theory of relativity never existed, let alone a decent conversation. Journalism in its most giddy, confabulatory moments is described as giving a voice to those who cannot be heard. Often the media instead lends its platform to those who have self-appointed themselves to speak for those who cannot be heard. In 2008, when police confiscated famed photographer Bill Henson's work from a Sydney gallery on the charge of child pornography, Henson had stated that he couldn't control how individuals reacted to his work. Sebastian Smee, an art critic, agreed in his opinion piece, but he also added that it wasn't individuals the photographer has to worry about. It is groups and individuals claiming to represent groups, wrote Smee. People, in other words, who have given themselves the task of speaking on behalf of others. Smee went on to say that Western society has become a place of maximum visibility, and yet the values of brightness and transparency that are often emphasised in the media are often little more than a veneer for various kinds of bullying. It was a Queensland writer, Melissa Lushenko, who once said that the word for deafness in many Aboriginal languages is the same word for mental illness. In some dialects of Bundjalung, you could say of someone that they are binangunj, ears broken, can't hear, won't hear. So, are the media's ears broken? Politicians' ears broken? Are our ears broken? We do, after all, seem mentally unhinged, with our tireless focus on the visible. And under this chorus of ideologies, how does one not become bullied into apathy and complicity? How does truth not become vacuous when for every statement there is another equally convincing statement to negate it? But none of this would matter if it was working. But it's not. Newspapers are dying. Circulation numbers are receding. Recent leaks on Crikey revealed that Fairfax are practically giving their papers away for free. Even then, people aren't taking the paper. Why? Chances are they've already seen the news. The news cycle has become one globular mass, and newspapers don't seem to be able to distinguish themselves from the pack. After all, who are they taking their cues from? The community? People on the street? No, they're taking their cues from the media. From the steely stares of Tony Jones and the probing thoughts of Kerry O'Brien in the evening, through to morning radio such as 3AW Talkback, the news is rarely new. So when Jason Jones of America's comedy program, The Daily Show, once asked the editor of the New York Times a very awkward question as he waved the paper at him, Jones said, "Okay, so can you show me something in the paper that happened today?" The editor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, nothing happened today." Which is where the internet comes in. The internet is not to blame for the death of the newspaper. It is a failure of the newspaper's imagination that has brought it to its knees, an inability to see the merits of its medium and its greed for omniscience. If anything, the internet is perhaps the newspaper's saviour. The internet can do quick news. Let the internet be shackled to the incremental shuffle of politicians and impossible deadlines exploited by public relations bodies. One of the many cliches that the newspaper often purported about itself was it put out the first draft of history. But is that something to be proud of? In my experience, I found that most first drafts are careless, thoughtless, and verbally violent. Isn't it dangerous to start setting facts in cement without reflection and discussion? Henry Grunwald, the editor of Time magazine in the 70s and 80s, once wrote that journalism can never be silent. That is its greatest virtue and its greatest fault. It must speak and speak immediately, while the echoes of wonder, the claims of triumph, and the signs of horror are still in the air. Nice quote, but is it true? Or has it been the product that requires journalists to speak immediately? Journalists are no longer the gatekeepers of information. That's true, and it's also true that the internet is a reason for this shift in responsibilities. The advent of the hyperlink auto-replaced the current copy, cut, paste, tweak to make it seem local era of journalism. A hyperlink can send a reader straight to the story's original source. As Jeff Jarvis, a media critic for The Guardian, advocated in 2006, the internet's hyperlink should create a system of news sharing. Newspapers, he wrote, ought to stop wasting their resources by covering what everyone else covers, just to feed their institutional ego under their own bylines. They should instead stand out by not sending the 100th correspondent to a news event that witnesses are covering anyway, but they should be doing what journalists do best, reporting. In short, journalists can be journalists again. By continuing to play the charade of staged news, putting themselves in a race for immediate news, a race they're destined to lose, newspapers will die. But what if they resisted the well-worn debates of left and right, or let's be honest, colleagues and rivals, and ignore the economic demand to speak immediately? What if, instead of filing a hurried story, print journalists took a step back, analysed the framework around these false media battlegrounds? What if they unravelled the marionette of informers? In this age of quick turnover and knee-jerk reaction, where every story has a potential to be exploited, print journalists are more important than ever. We can be journalists again, or we can carp and snipe at these broken down gates like castrated Dobermans, or an old man in palliative care.